Lovely. So we'll get started. First of all, my pleasure to welcome you along this afternoon to our Zoom tasting and our first look at the 2018 wines from Bordeaux. We've been waiting a long time for these wines to arrive and are just delighted to be able to talk to you about them and taste them with you this afternoon. We would rather, of course, be doing that in person, but certainly this is a very, very good alternative. So my name's Liz Whedon. I'm the General Manager at Glengarry, and I'm joined this afternoon by Regan McCaffrey. Regan looks after our fine wine based at our Victoria Park store normally, based at the moment at home. So Regan and I are going to split talking to you about the wines this afternoon, and also have with us Anthony Sorensen. So you'll find him on the screen under T there. And if you've got any questions through the tasting or need a hand with anything, then either Regan or myself, but as we'll be talking, T is probably a better person to go to in the first instance. So how this afternoon will work is I'm going to start with just a bit of an overview for you of the 2018 vintage. And then I'll talk to you about one of the wines and then pass the baton, if you like, to Regan. So we'll alternate as we go through. You've got the samples there in front of you. We do have everyone on mute at the moment. Encourage you to use the chat function as we go through. You know, it's lovely when you come to a tasting in person to sit there and talk to the person next door about what do they think about the wine. So feel free to chat away as we go through. And also, if you've got any questions of us, please do use the chat function. When we get to the end of a tasting, we will do a Q&A at that stage, and we'll unmute everyone, and you're welcome to ask any questions at that stage as well. So on to the 2018 vintage. It's a really interesting vintage from a number of sort of angles. As I mentioned before, there have been significant delays in getting these wines here, and I guess that's probably a good place to start. We shipped these wines earlier than we've ever shipped our Empereur, and we really pushed our suppliers in France to get them on boats early. Despite that, this has been the longest shipment I've seen of any container. In fact, our quantities of this particular vintage are very good, so it's containers, but it's been the longest shipment time I've seen. I guess what's important to know or to share with you, given that the shipment has been so long, is that the containers were refrigerated, but not just that they were refrigerated, they were turned on. And I think that's a really important thing to note. You know, we see a lot of people advertise that they're using refrigerated containers, but are they actually paying for them to be turned on? Because it is a very expensive way of shipping. It's also very difficult because at the moment there's not enough refrigerated containers coming to New Zealand, which is one of the big challenges, is that, you know, finding refrigerated containers to come down here is becoming increasingly difficult. So with all of that, what does it mean? Well, it means that your wine that you're tasting today and that the 18s that you'll purchase from us have come to New Zealand in the best shipping conditions. And we actually had some shipping gauges or temperature gauges in a container recently that we got the results back from, and they were independently read. So it wasn't something that we did. It was something that actually one of our Burgundy domains did, and they sent us the graph of the shipping, and the temperature stayed a constant 15 degrees the entire time, and that's exactly what you want it to do. I think it moved like 2 degrees in total through the entire shipment. You know, it was very, very consistent. And I guess this is the thing that you can expect with Glengarry when it comes to Bordeaux, is that we are going to ship it right, but also that there's some expertise there. This vintage is the last vintage, sadly, that I tasted in Bordeaux. Since then, obviously, haven't been able to travel, which has been very sad, but there's been sort of silver lining to it all, I guess. And, you know, as we are finding through what COVID's made us do, which has changed a lot of the way we do things, is that we have tasted, well, I have tasted the 19 and the 20 vintage, so the ones subsequent to this, but I've been able to taste them here in New Zealand. And the first year, the 19s, I'd say the Bordelais sort of scrambled to work out how they were going to get them around the world. But certainly this last vintage, it was a lot better. And what's been good about that is that I've been able to taste with the team here, and I've really enjoyed that. But certainly do miss the opportunity to go and taste these. Now, when I tasted these, the 18s that we're about to look at now, of course, I was tasting them as unfinished wines. So I was tasting them before what we call en primeur sales, which is where we sell the wines when they're not finished wines, they're still resting in barrel. We're starting to rest in barrel. They've just been very much finished. In fact, a lot of the time, the final blend hasn't been put together, but it's a process that happens in April, May, after vintage each year, where critics and media from around the world are invited to Bordeaux to taste en primeur. So I was very fortunate to taste these in Bordeaux, and I remember at the time it was a vintage that I had an absolute ball of a time because it was so glorious to taste these wines. Right from when they're very, very young, these wines have been super delicious, and I think you're going to see that through the tasting today. So if you had to look at the 18 vintage and sum it up, you know, what's this vintage about? Well, overall, this is a great to excellent vintage. And it is, you know, if you've followed Bordeaux for a little while, you'll know that excellent vintages, there's been quite a few recently. But this one, we sit from great to excellent. There's certainly parts of it that are exceptional, but overall, it's of a very, very high quality. It is also a vintage to explore, one that will benefit from cellaring, and one that is good from sort of the entry level price points. You know, even the Petit Chateau that we've brought in at, you know, $20 a bottle are excellent, right up to the top wines. If you had to sum it up, it's a vintage that talks about purity, a seductive nature to it, and I think we'll see that definitely through these wines. The vintage characteristics are coming from a very unusual set of weather patterns. So the winter prior to the vintage was unusually wet. It rained continuously through spring. There was very severe mildew and hail pressure. So whilst this is an excellent vintage, it's also very, very small. In fact, somewhere like Ponte Canet, so top property, in fact, the scores that have come out for Ponte 2018 recently put it as one of the best wines of the vintage. They produced 11 hectolitres per hectare. So they got hit by frost, but also it's the biodynamic farming methods that they're using. This vintage wasn't kind to anyone practicing organically or biodynamically because the mildew, they just couldn't fight it. It was just so severe that anything natural was not going to help. So what followed that very wet season was a very, very warm summer. The heat continued month after month, and in fact created a drought. So we went from too much rain, mildew, hail, very wet start to a drought. And in fact, it was the hottest summer in Bordeaux in the 20th century. So very, very hot. What that then meant is the vineyards where the vineyard health was very good and there's water retention played a really important part in this vintage. So Pomerol has done quite well because it's predominantly clay-based soils there and clay retains the water nicely. If you've got old vineyards on gravel with really deep roots, then they will have been able to access the water that came in the spring. So it does, this is why it's great to excellent, not consistently excellent, is there are pockets that if the vineyards weren't managed well, the water retention wasn't there, the drought-like conditions are going to have produced overripe wines. Fortunately, a little rain came at the right time. It was just before vintage, but it provided some freshness to the wines. The alcohol percentages for this vintage, and we can tell you what they are as we go through, they are generally quite high. Now, if you're sitting there thinking, God, is it another Bordeaux vintage with high ABVs and it's, you know, it's like the 2003 vintage? No, they don't taste like the alcohol percentage that's there. And that's because the spring was wet and dry, and then it dried out. So there was water first and then it got hot. 2003, it just generally was hot. And the nice thing is that although it's got that concentration of fruit and it's got that sort of richness and intensity, when the rain came before vintage, it really did freshen them up, and there's a lovely level of acidity through these wines. And the acidity together with the concentration and the intensity of the tannins, of course, are the key characteristics that you need to have wines that are going to age well. And these characteristics are present in these wines, and it is going to mean that this is going to be a very long-lived vintage. When we talk about a new vintage in Bordeaux, I'm often asked, you know, what does it closely relate to? And I always hate sort of putting a, you know, it's like this vintage or it's like that vintage, because each one is unique. But it's got some of the warmth of 2003. It's got the ripeness of 2009. It's got some of the freshness of 2010. But really the answer is it's got its own character. The purity that I talked about at the beginning, that does really come through in the Cabernet, which reminds me of the 16 vintage. But the richness of the fruit probably does compare it a little bit more to 2009. So then the freshness that I mentioned, somewhere between 2010 and 2015. Now, white wine we're not tasting today, but white wine was not an easy task. Drought conditions are not generally good for white wine. There are some that are very good, but they tend to be more tropical and quite rich Sauvignon Blanc based wines. Sauterne, it's a game of two halves, because some of the producers got nervous because of the amount of moisture botrytis did form, but they needed to wait until the rain stopped to pick, and there was the risk of losing the whole vintage. The top properties in Ruisec and Akem and Coute come to mind. They waited. They're fortunate enough to have bank balances that mean that they can wait. So they waited and they picked, and they were rewarded with excellent wines. Those who picked early, they've got lovely sort of fresh, sweet wines, but not wines for longevity. Before I get into the first wine, just one more thing to say is, because of the variety of weather conditions through this vintage, what you definitely can't do with this vintage is go, it's a year that favoured Cabernet, or it's a year that favoured Merlot, or it's a year that favoured the left or the right, because it really does come down to how each property approached it and what state each property was in. So it does provide a little bit of variability, which is where tastings like this and giving you an opportunity to taste through the wines is a good way to go. So on that, should we go on to the first wine? Enough of an intro, Regan? Cool. Okay, so the first wine, you've got glass number 1 there. We have Chateau Puy Blanca. So if you haven't already, have a taste of that. I'm just going to have a little taste myself. So Chateau Puy Blanca is a Saint-Emilion. So Saint-Emilion on the right bank. And the vineyards here are all based around the very delightful village of Saint-Emilion. Now, when we look at Bordeaux, on the left bank, we do have the 1855 classification. On the right bank, Saint-Emilion and Pomerol. Pomerol, we have no classification, but we do in Saint-Emilion have a classification. Their classification actually does allow for regular revision. It's been revised recently, and it's currently being disputed through the French courts because no one can agree on the classification. But this is a Saint-Emilion Grand Cru that we're tasting, Puy Blanca. And it is made up of 85% Merlot, 10% Cabernet Franc, and 5% Cabernet. And typically with Saint-Emilion, this is where you find a lot of Cabernet Franc. In fact, one of the greatest Cabernet Franc based wines in the world, Chateau Cheval Blanc, comes from Saint-Emilion. The vineyard itself, Puy Blanca, is predominantly clay. You'll notice as I go through these wines that I will call out the soil type, because I think given the weather conditions, it is quite relevant. And the fact that there's clay here is why we're seeing a lot of richness in the Merlot here. This is under the Moex stable. And just to explain that, the Moex family are negociants, and what that means is that they buy and they sell wine generally. That is what their business is. These guys are a little bit different because they're also owners of vineyards and look after the viticulture and vinification for some properties as well. So the Moex family, they have a negotiant business called JP Moex. And this, as part of that business, one of the properties they look after is Chateau Puy Blanca. They actually did own it, and at the stage this wine was made, they owned it, but they sold it in 2020. And actually, ironically, how things go round in circles, they sold it to the family that originally owned it in the 18th century. In terms of the site itself, as I said, it's clay, it's in Saint-Emilion. It is a site that has a combination of some gentle slopes and a little bit of down on the hillside in Saint-Emilion. The vines are sitting at a density of 5,000 vines per hectare. Very traditional winemaking here. So the winemaking, it's fermented in cement tanks. The cement tanks historically wouldn't have had temperature regulation, but under the Moex family, they do. They've fitted them with thermoregulators. The malolactic fermentation will happen in the tank as well. And then actually only 20% of this wine has seen oak. So the rest of it actually stays in those cement tanks. And the part that goes into oak, only 10% of that is new French oak. So it stays in oak for 12 months, but relatively this doesn't have a high amount of oak. In terms of their viticulture, it's very consistent with the Moex approach to things. And what they say is it's not biodynamic, it's not organic, but they call it le raisonner. So in English means the reason to struggle. So they will do everything possible to keep it as organic as possible, but within reason. If they need to do something to look after the vineyard, they will. They do plough the soil. In fact, they do a lot of ploughing through these vineyards, and that's to encourage the roots to go deep. They don't want the roots going sideways or coming up near the surface, because in years like this where they needed to access the water table when it was right down deep, then you want the roots right down, and they do that by ploughing regularly. They do a green harvest, which means that they go through and they will get rid of some of the bunches to concentrate the remaining bunches. So they will control their yield, They didn't need to do a lot of that in this particular year. They pick everything by hand, and although I said it's quite traditional here, they do now use an optical sorter. So the MOEX influence here does provide resources that, you know, for a property this size, historically, they wouldn't have had access to. The vine age is 25 years for this property. And this, I think, it's a lovely place to start because it's not the most serious of Saint-Emilions in the world, but I think it shows you a wine that, you know, for the next 2 to 5 years, you could have this in your cellar. I mean, you can see by tasting it right now, you could enjoy this right now, but it also would benefit from sort of 2 to 5 years, but not much longer than that. What do you think, Regan?
I have to say, Liz, this is a wine that has just got better and better over the last decade. Like, it's almost like, unless it's a bad vintage, it's always better than the year before. And this is certainly the most opulent, I think, Puy Blanca I've ever tried. You can see that, I think, in Antonio Gallone's notes that's in the booklet there. He says it's especially lush, almost shockingly so for a Saint-Emilion that's usually quite classic. And I have to say, in the older days, 10 to 15 years ago, I actually found Puy Blanca a little bit austere for a Saint-Emilion. It actually didn't have the weight of kind of lush, creamy fruit that I was looking for. And then that's just got better and better. And man, this year is spectacular. I mean, that is exactly what you're looking for when you drink Saint-Emilion. Exactly.
And I think it's also got that nice sort of mocha character, the sort of chocolate coffee spice that I think is a character that's really typical of Saint-Emilion when it's right. You know, 100% that when Saint-Emilion is not ripe like this and it's not well made, you get sort of steely, lean styles, and they're not that pleasant. You know, this is an incredible result for this chateau and this vintage. Yeah, exceptional place to start. Should we keep going on Saint-Emilion with the next wine, Regan?
Yes, right. Okay, wine number 2 is Chateau Lucia. Now, this is a pretty small chateau. It's got a 7-hectare vineyard, and they're literally probably 20 meters or so from the center of the edge of the buildings in the medieval town, right? So it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site in Saint-Emilion, one of the oldest wine-growing regions in all of Bordeaux. And the village itself is right on the top of the limestone plateau. So this is in a different part of Saint-Emilion from where Puy Blanca is from. So basically, this is a south-facing limestone plateau, and the name Lucia basically means the greenhouse. So you can think about how warm it gets up here on this edge of the plateau. It's got a thin layer of kind of clay over the top, and then it's pretty solid limestone going down from there. So a little bit like how Liz said earlier about how the clay in Pomerol is particularly good in dry years for releasing moisture. Well, it's the same in this part of the limestone plateau of Saint-Emilion. So you've got your limestone soil gives you really good drainage in the wet years because it acts like a sponge. It soaks up all the water, but then that retains it and it releases it again in those years where it gets quite dry. And it releases all the moisture from the rainy season. And that high percentage of active limestone also adds pH and that mineral element to the soil. So you often find the wines from the plateau have a real mineral character to them. And the vines have very, very deep roots in this part of Saint-Emilion as well. So Lucia's got some very, very old vines. I think the average vine age here is 35 years of age. So I guess before we talk about the chateau, let's start by giving it a taste because I haven't tried it yet. Wow, this is another chateau, a little bit like Puy Blanca, that again has just got better and better over the last decade. Now, the chateau itself was built around the end of the 17th century, and the property was purchased in the late 1800s by a guy called Albert Macquan, and he owned Chateau Macquan, which is kind of next door to this as well. And it was purchased in the 1950s by the Darfy family, and they still own and manage the estate today. So they've owned it for the last 70 years or so. Now, they own and manage the estate, but most of the winemaking, the vineyard management, all the marketing, again, is all handled by the Moex negotiants who own Petrus and that as well. So they're the exclusive distributor of this wine as well, and they help a lot with the winemaking side of things. So Luc Darfield, he's the owner. He's very much got a traditional approach again to making the wines here. All the soil is tilled manually. It's tilled by horses here. So there's no tractors, no herbicides. They keep the vineyard work to the minimum, basically, to let that character shine through. Harvest, again, is all manual. They've got some of that optical sorting machine as well now that they have at Puy Blanca, thanks to the association with the Moex group. And really, they keep quite traditional interventions all the way through, pruning, debudding, just to keep your yields down, but they're not doing anything kind of particularly crazy here at all. It's just really that optical sorting, a little bit of pre-fermentation, cold maceration. Those are kind of the new elements, but they're really trying to go for a very pure expression here. And you'll see that this is a lot of Merlot in it. So we're now looking at 80% Merlot and 20% Cabernet Franc. No Cabernet Sauvignon in this at all. And this is coming in at 14% this year. So this is 0.5% below the first wine. All the alcoholic fermentation, the Malo fermentation happens in a mix of concrete and stainless steel vats here. And then when it goes into barrel, it goes into that for 18 months. And there's a lot more new oak here than we saw in the first wine. We're looking at 50% new oak here. So that's quite significant. This is usually a bigger, richer wine than Puy Blanca, which is why that Puy Blanca is so impressive this year, because it's a little bit kind of different to how we've seen in previous years. Do you remember trying this one, Liz, when it first came out?
Yeah, I went back to during the En Primeur campaign, what did we recommend as our buys, our the wines that stood out, and this was sitting there on the list for sure. I think we've just had some comments here, Regan, which I think sort of sum it up as, it's just so showy because of all of that oak. And after the Puy Blanca, it's showing a massive step up, which I think is really cool. But if you go back to the Puy Blanca, that's also now showing what incredible value it is.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is certainly a wine that needs a lot more time than the Puy Blanca to come around. The Puy Blanca is one that I wouldn't mind aging it a little bit longer than you said, maybe up to 10 max, though. I think that style of fruit is not one that's really going to make super old bones. Whereas this Lucia here, you can see there's quite a lot of vanilla coming from that new oak there at the moment. It's showing promise, but it's only going to get better. I mean, this probably needs 5 years or so to settle down, and then it'll drink well from maybe like age 5 to 15. I think that's probably the sweet spot for this one.
Yeah, I think equally, because it's got so much sort of oak and, that's adding a lot of sort of structure and, a nice frame around that delicious fruit. It is the kind of wine that I think you could throw in a decanter, give quite a bit of air right now. And particularly if you're enjoying that fruit, then I'd see nothing wrong with that Lucia right now with some air and, something, a good piece of steak with it. I think you'd be away.
Yeah, absolutely. You will see, guys, as we go through this tasting, we jump around in price a little bit. So we're tasting them in their appellations, and then they're in price order within that appellation. So we'll always go from cheapest to most expensive within Saint-Emilion, Pomerol, Pauillac, wherever we're kind of looking at here. But today is the first day we're tasting these wines since they landed as well. So they're not in an order in terms of style. They're in price order within their appellations to try and have a look at.
Very good. Cool. Yeah, it's lovely to be able to see them now in bottle, because they're now complete wines versus what I tried a couple of years ago, which were created to give us an idea of what the vintage looked like. And we've mentioned a few times through this tasting the Moex family and that negociant. And I mentioned the word negociant before, but the Bordeaux system, how it works is it's an open market. So for these wines, the negociant JP Moex will offer them out en primeur and offer them to a number of, well, around the world, to hundreds of different retailers and porters, and they will be sold en primeur, and then 2 years later they will be shipped. So it's a very, very old sort of market system. The en primeur system is actually not that old, but the market system of going through a negociant is quite old and quite fundamental to the Bordeaux region. The Moex family and the JP Moex negociant, they, of all of the places to go and taste en primeur, they are meticulous with preparing their samples in two ways. They are insistent on trying to make it as close as possible to what is finally bottled, because of course the wines that you're tasting when you taste them en primeur are not the final wines. And, you know, there's been some wonderful scandals over the years of people putting wines up to be tasted by critics and then bottling something completely different. Moex, they're sticklers for that, but also the way they prepare their samples and what they do, it's the best place to taste because the wines always look amazing. And you'll see through this tasting, we do have quite a few wines that are from that negociant or are involved with them. They are a negociant that we partner with here in New Zealand and have done since the 82 vintage that we imported and sold. So it's a very long standing relationship for us with the Moex family, which is very good. Shall we go on, Regan?
Yeah, I have to say, Liz, Saint-Emilion is never my favorite appellation. Of the Merlot dominant ones, I'm more a Pomerol fan. And sometimes in the rich, warm vintages, I find the Saint-Emilions overly alcoholic and a bit blousy, but these have all of the richness to them and that opulence, but without feeling like they're fat or flabby or overly alcoholic at all. Like, it's rare to find wines that are that full on and sensual, but without feeling flabby. Like, there's still lovely acidity there, lovely tannins to them. Yeah, they're beautiful.
Yeah, and I think that's what you're going to see as you keep going through these wines is, yeah, the alcohols are not shy in them. In fact, we're going to get to 15 and possibly even 15.5 as we go on a little bit. I think it's probably labelled at 15, but I think it's higher. But it's not going to show when you're tasting them because the balance is there. There's just so much concentration to these wines for sure. Right, so the next one that we've got to look at, so that was our Saint-Emilion part of the tasting. We're now going on to Pomerol. And when we were putting this tasting together, I think my original lineup, I had pretty much all Saint-Emilion and Pomerol. And Regan rang me and he said, you know, you might need to venture somewhere else. And it was a complete mistake, but also partly because Saint-Emilion and Pomerol just look great from the 2018 vintage. So we are moving to Pomerol next. So we're moving to Lagrange à Pomerol. So Lagrange is a chateau that is often confused because Lagrange in Pomerol is little known and Lagrange Saint-Julien on the other side of the river is very well known. So this is perhaps the one that you haven't tried. If you've tried Lagrange before, it quite possibly is the Saint-Julien, but we have Lagrange, which is the Pomerol. It is quite a small vineyard, so it's 9 hectares. It actually dates back to the 19th century, and it was called Lagrange Tropschild at that stage. So it had a different name, but that didn't last for a huge amount of time, and it just simply became known as Lagrange. It is gravel on top of clay. Importantly, the clay that is in this particular vineyard is a really important blue clay. That if you ever hear anyone talking about Petrus, they will talk about the fact that it is solely on a very special pocket of blue clay. Where Lagrange sits is it sits on gravel on top of clay, And some of that clay under Lagrange is the blue clay that is also under Petrus. So it's got very, very good soil structure under it. It sits at the northern border of the plateau that sits on the top of Pomerol. And it does have some really good neighbours. It's got Lagay sitting beside it. And it's sitting actually just behind Chateau Lucia and Chateau Petrus, but sit right on the top of the plateau. This chateau was actually purchased by the Moex family. They purchased it in 1953. It is tiny production. They actually only make 2,000 cases here, which in Bordeaux standards is tiny. If you compare it to some New Zealand production levels, you're probably thinking, oh, that's okay. But in terms of Bordeaux, 2,000 is very, very small. The winemaking, hand harvested, it is those concrete tanks again, so very, very similar to Puy Blanca. It is the optical sorting. So we've mentioned optical sorting a couple of times. Just to elaborate a little bit more on that, optical sorting, it's a very, very expensive machine, but essentially the berries come along a conveyor and a photo is taken of them, and it's compared very, very quickly to what the winemaker has set as what a perfect berry looks like. If the berry, when it comes through the optical sorter, is right, it keeps going. If it's not right, it gets a little shot of air on it, which will push it down into the bin of not ripe berries. So it's an optical way of sorting them into being absolutely ideal, and it gets rid of anything that is not deemed to be perfect. Anything that's not used by Lagrange will probably be pressed still, but will be sold off to a negociant to be used in a generic wine and probably just end up in a bistro somewhere around France for a very small amount of money. It is aged in oak, 40% of which is new, for 16 months. And actually, interestingly, with this wine, the chateau's so tiny and obscure, it actually doesn't have its own winery. So this wine is actually made at Chateau Trotanoir. Now, Trotanoir, if you know that property, sells for a very large amount of money and is very, very rare. But this Lagrange is not far away, and the grapes are taken to Trotanoir, and it's actually the team at Trotanoir that make this. So you talk of, you know, those lovely finds out there, all those bargains that, if you know the inside story behind them, are a really good buy, then this is exactly that. So have you had a taste? Have you had a taste? I hope you've tasted while I've been talking. Oh, that nose is delicious.
It's one of the few that are 100% Merlot as well. There's Petrus itself is 100% Merlot. La Fleur is 100% Merlot, and so is La Palme. And those three, La Palme, La Fleur, and Petrus, are the three most expensive wines in Bordeaux, and they're all in Pomerol. And apart from those three, there's very few estates in Pomerol that are 100% Merlot, and this is one of them at Lagrange.
We've just had a comment there from Glenn. I think it sums it up, Glenn, because yeah, if you've had this wine before, it is a wine that you know, has had a checkered past. It's not always been at the quality level that it's at now, and certainly the Moex family have a tendency to buy things that they can see the potential of, and they have obviously the resources to throw into it, and that's exactly what they've done with this wine. And the complexity is amazing, and that's a very, very good Pomerol for sure. Wow, I'm super impressed with that. I was looking forward to retrying it, and it's been, yeah, it's everything that I thought it was going to be. Very cool.
When you think 100% Merlot in New Zealand out of, say, Waiheke or Hawke's Bay, you're often thinking of something that's got a lot of bright upfront fruit but doesn't have a lot of structure underneath. But that's very, very different. And in Pomerol, you do have that tannic structure, and you can see that in this as well, supporting all of that fruit.
Yeah, for sure. And I think this is showing, you know, what Merlot can be. I don't think we see in many parts of the world serious Merlot. It's all too often made into, you know, sort of quite easy drinking, you know, value wines, because it does that very well. It can crop very well and can produce volume, but it's a very, very different expression to when it's grown on clay or heavy, deep soils, and it produces this lovely, rich, spicy style. Again, you know, that it's got the depth of the fruit there, but it's also got that sort of mocha character as well, in a different way to those Saint-Emilions. Very good. So where are we heading next, Regan?
All right, well, we're staying in Pomerol. We've actually got 3 Pomerol wines, which is quite fun. So I'll give you guys a little bit more information about Pomerol. So firstly, it's the smallest of all of the major appellations in Bordeaux. It's only around about 800 hectares planted. It's the only major appellation in Bordeaux that has no classification. So it never has, and it probably never will have a classification to it. People just know what the grape wines are. And one of the reasons for that is that it was the last of the major regions to become fully planted. And that didn't take place until kind of the late 19th century. It's not very big. You're only looking at maybe about 3 kilometers by 4 kilometers. A lot of clay in the soil as well, but it is one of the oldest regions geographically. Saint-Emilion was planted by the Romans, of course, but Pomerol, which is kind of not far from it, was basically ignored. Didn't really start to produce wine until the early 1300s, but was really an afterthought as there wasn't much coming out of there. Really, it started to develop as a commune in the 1700s, and farmers started to switch their crops at that point from wheat and produce to growing grapes for wine. But just because the gravel and the clay and the sandy soils were so poor, you couldn't grow much else except for vines at the time. And there was only a small amount of Pomerol under vine. There was a lot of Cabernet Franc, a little bit more Cabernet, and not so much Merlot. The Merlot didn't come until after the huge frost in 1956 that destroyed most of the appellation. And when the replanting happened at that time, they replanted with Merlot. Now, Liz was mentioning that we've been importing from Moet since 1982. Well, it was really 1982 that Pomerol became famous, when Robert Parker gave some huge scores to some of the estates, Petrus particularly, that it really started to gain attention. Up until that point, really most of the Pomerol wines were sold to merchants in the Netherlands and Belgium. For a long time, a lot of the wines of Pomerol weren't even bottled at the chateau. They were sent to Belgium and they were bottled by various negociants there, just because that was the major market for them. So it's really one of the last estates to kind of really come into its own. Right, now, talking of history, what we've got here is a lot of history at this estate, Chateau Gazan. So let's give this a taste and then we'll have a talk about it. Now, this is a kind of an unusual blend for Pomerol. You see this is 75% Merlot, but it also has 25% Cabernet Sauvignon in it. And that's quite a large amount for Pomerol. Now, as we said, the vineyards of Pomerol gradually developed somewhere between the 12th century and the French Revolution. And the Knights of St. Jean of Jerusalem, Rhodes, and Malta really controlled this area at the time. And you can see the cross of the Order of the Knights on the front of the bottle there. And the location where Chateau Gazan is now was a hamlet all the way through to the 18th century. And it's probably located on a site that was known as the Hospital of Pomerol. And that was built by the Crusading Knights to receive pilgrims as they came back through on the Santiago route up from Spain, up through Bordeaux, up to Paris. And of course, that's the inspiration for the name of this wine, Le Hospitalet de Gazan, the Hospital of Gazan. Now, they've got quite a large vineyard for Pomerol, 26 hectares. But the unusual thing about it is it's in a single holding. So it's all in one continuous vineyard. It's not in separate plots kind of around the appellation. And it's all on the upper terrace of the Pomerol terroir. And you've got some level of gravel, maybe 500 mils to a metre on the surface. And then beneath that in the subsoil, it's blue clay and green clay with some iron oxides. And these clay ensure that the vines have always got that steady, stable supply of water. And as Liz mentioned, that blue clay, that's what makes Pomerol famous. It's particularly good for growing Merlot on. And as she mentioned, Chateau Petrus is 100% on the blue clay. And one of the reasons that they're 100% on the blue clay is that a large section of Gazan was actually sold to Chateau Petrus in the 1950s, some of their best terroir, unfortunately, and that contributed to how good Petrus is today. The only other estate in the world I can think of that is 100% based on blue clay is the Maceto Vineyard in Tuscany, made by Ornellaia. That's also 100% Merlot, one of the great Merlots of the world as well. And it's also on a small patch of blue clay. I think it's the largest patch of blue clay that they've ever found outside of Pomerol and Bordeaux. Right now, when they're making the wines themselves, obviously everything here is hand-picked, hand-harvest. You've got an initial sorting in the vineyard that the pickers carry out. Very experienced pick team come back every year. Then you've got two further stages of sorting. One takes place just before it comes through, and another one in the vat room before and after removal of the stalks to make sure they've got the best quality fruit coming in there. All of your fermentation takes place in concrete here, separated out by your Cabernet, your Merlot, and all of your different plots. You've got a kind of a maceration of the juice in the skins for about 3 weeks. Then they run that juice off, and your secondary kind of malolactic fermentation is carried out with, again, those varieties and plots being kept separate. Some of them in barrels at this stage, and some of them in vats. It kind of depends on the quality of the batches for that particular year. Then it goes into oak, and you're looking at generally 50% new oak for Gazan itself and 30% new oak for La Hospitalette de Gazan. Both of them for 18 months, and they rack it kind of every 3 months or so. So both wines are kind of quite similar in their makeup, except you'll have a lot more Merlot in Gazan itself. That usually sits closer to the makeup of the vineyard, which is 90% Merlot. So you can see they've got 90% Merlot, 10% Cabernet in the vineyard, and that's basically the makeup of the Grand Vin. But in this, the second wine, you get a lot more of the Cabernet coming in. So that shows you the quality of the Merlot they've got. Now in 2018, they actually had a very special label on Gazan itself, on the Grand Vin, because it was the 100th vintage for the family in Pomerol, with 1918 to 2018. And they produced, I think, 63,000 bottles of Gazan and 22,000 bottles of La Hospitalette de Gazan. So even though this is the second wine, it's actually much harder to find. Only a third of this, as much of it was produced as they produced the Grand Vin. But Gazan really rates this vintage. They said it was undoubtedly one of the greatest produced from their estate in the last 30 years. And they thought in terms of finesse, it was better than the very good 2016, with incredible freshness to the wines and a really long aftertaste. And then they think the classic Pomerol notes are going to come through as this wine ages. You're going to get more of the undergrowth, the game, the truffle flavors coming through as well. But you've got really silky tannins here balancing that alcohol. This is, again, quite high. This is 14% alcohol in this, but you don't notice it. Extremely well balanced. This Gazan is getting to be quite an expensive wine now. So it's still quite nice that we get some reasonably good stocks of the Hospitalette, because it is a reasonable approximation of the Grand Vin, even though it does have less Merlot, but it still shows that real elegance we usually see in the wine.
It's very good, Regan. It's fantastic. I think, we've seen quite a lot of variation in these wines in terms of style, and I think, this is another shift again. And we've had some comments here on, the amount of Cabernet is obviously up in this wine in comparison to what we've looked at. And I think that is giving it a very different structure together with the location and the soil here is very different to what we've looked at with the other wines. So I know it's probably sounding like we're talking a lot about clay and gravel and they all sound quite similar, but these vineyards, the exposition of them is very, very different, and with such particular weather conditions in a vintage like this, it really does make a massive difference.
Yeah, I see, Chris, you've mentioned it's quite grippy compared to the Lagrange. I would definitely say that's the Cabernet percentage in that. It's not the oak treatment.
Mm. Yeah, for sure. I think the oak's actually really well managed in it, which you would expect given, the provenance of this wine, for sure. Cool, excellent. Right, well, that's flight. Yeah, I was going to say that's flight one, and how amazing were those wines? I think you can see why, if you've been receiving our email marketing and had us wax on about the 18 vintage and gone, God, they're getting far too excited here. You can hopefully now see why we're excited about this vintage. So I can see a lot of people are diligently doing this already, but you do need to pour the next 4 wines, or at least pour the first of the wines, and then we'll get started on the last 4. We'll just give you a couple of seconds to do that. I think, yep, awesome so far. Agree 100%, Chris. Is everyone ready on the next one? Have I got a few thumbs up that we're ready, or do you need a bit of time? Oh, yep, I've got some thumbs up, some waving. This is excellent. Okay. We're almost there. Okay, cool. Right, so we are sticking with Pomerol, and we are now moving to Bourg-Neuf. So Bourg-Neuf is again another property that has a MOEX association. There's certainly a number of them, as I mentioned, in this tasting. This one, though, this one's really special. The ownership of this chateau is the Veyron family. And it's a family that has owned this property since 1821. And they send their wine all over the world, but like to just share a little story with you. I was visiting with the MOEX team, and we headed into the centre of Les Bonnes, so just behind where their warehouse is there, and just down from Pomerol. And we were heading into a restaurant, very, very traditional restaurant, and arriving with our bottles of wine, as you do. And we walked in, and one of the Veyron family, so the current mother and father that are the current generation, it's been 6 generations, was just finishing their lunch. And one of the team from MOEX introduced me, and they turned around in some beautiful English and said, "You've been importing our wine into New Zealand for over 20 years, and we very much appreciate it." And I thought, here's a property that sell through a negotiant and send what in the grander scheme of things must be a small amount of wine all the way to New Zealand. But the point being, they knew they sent it to us, and they appreciated the ongoing business. So it was lovely, and it very much, this chateau is all about the story of a family. The property size hasn't changed since 1821, so they haven't tried to buy any more land or to get bigger. It's been 8.86 hectares the entire time. In 2008, the youngest daughter has taken over, and she's managing the property today. You might see, if you have travelled a lot, obviously not recently, you might see Bourg-Neuf Veyron, and some labels just with Bourg-Neuf. From 1970 right through to the 2014 vintage, for some reason, they labelled the wine under 2 different labels and sent it to some countries as Bourg-Neuf Veyron and some countries as Bourg-Neuf. It's exactly the same wine. So I know that has confused people in the past, but just to clarify that one. Their location in Pomerol, they actually sit right next door to Trotanois. So we talked about Trotanois before. So right up on the plateau. and they sit beside a glazed Clinay, so really good positioning. It is a particularly warm site, and I think when we have a look at this wine, remembering it's a warm site, you'll see that in the wine. It's west facing and it does get a lot of sunshine. One of the particularities about Bourgneuf is that it actually has 4 different parts that are got 4 different soil types. So it gives, I think, with Bourgneuf a lot of complexity to it that sometimes you don't see in Pomerol. So there's one part which is their most prized, which is 100% clay. Then they've got a sandy part, a gravelly part, and then a clay part with some iron oxide in it as well. Now they do, with all the various parts, they do keep them separate as they bring them into the winery. So they've got cement tanks that are all variable in size, so they can keep all the parcels separate and then blend them together into the final cuvee. Regan mentioned before the devastating frosts of 1956. The warmth of a site and the specific location of Bourgneuf, they survived and have parts of their vineyard that survived that frost. Now that frost wiped out most of Pomerol, but because of that, their average vine age is 40 years, with some of their vines 70 years. And in fact, they've got a couple, not many vines, that are reportedly 120 and 130 years old, which makes it the oldest vine age in Pomerol at Chateau Bourgneuf. 6,000 vines per hectare here, so that's the density for the vineyard. As we've seen with the other wines, hand harvested, they do press off the grapes and only take the first pressing. The last part of the pressing, so they'll press and take essentially the free run and then a little bit of the next bit, and then the pressed wine, they will sell that off. And the free run, what comes out first from the berries, is going to be the best juice. It is fined with egg whites, so if we've got any vegans, I'm terribly sorry, this is not probably a wine for you if you're concerned about the fining. So let's have a look at it. So I think we're 80% Merlot and 20% Cabernet Franc.
I'm going to jump in here, Liz, and just say this is another awesome wine from Bourgneuf. This is a wine that I didn't used to like when I first started at Glengarry. It was too austere for me, really tannic, not enough fruit, a little bit kind of lean on the fruit side. And man, since 2015, the quality here has just exploded. 16 was incredible. 17, like absolutely delicious. And this is just another winner. It's so good.
That's incredible. Yeah, you have to wonder, Regan. I think around those years that you're talking, the Moix family do own Chateau Petrus, but what they've done, and I think it's quite interesting, is they've actually set up a different distribution company to handle Petrus. And everything that is Petrus is now done by one family member, and from all the decisions with the vineyard and the distribution, the entire thing. And it's actually given them a lot more focus for Petrus. They got rid of a third of their distributors around the world who were just auctioning their wine for the highest money. They've done a whole lot of things, but what it has done is it's removed the distraction that Petrus was.
Yeah, I agree.
And when you talk to the team there and you talk to, Edouard Moix, he said, Petrus was great to have, but everyone came and wanted to talk to them about Petrus. And by putting it still with the family, but over there, it's meant wines like this, they're now putting a lot more attention's the wrong way to put it, because they've always put attention, but they don't have the distraction of looking after what is so special, which is Petrus. So you'd agree?
Yeah, I mean, all of the Moex portfolio. I mean, the top ones, your Trotanoirs and your Hosannas and things. I mean, those have always been amazing, but it's these ones kind of at the lower end of the portfolio that have really increased in quality, like hugely. I think this, I think Galone actually mentions it in his note there, that it's just, seriously on the rise.
Yeah, it is. Stunning wine. I love the structure on the palate, the texture that's coming from that Cabernet Franc as well. Cabernet Franc has a high amount of pyrazines in it, so it's that sort of character. If you walk past a tomato plant and you brush against the leaf and you get that green characteristic, that's a pyrazine. And Cabernet Franc is a great variety, has a very high level of it. And if it's not handled right, it can make very green sort of tart or austere characteristics. But I think in this wine, and when done well, it adds an extra sort of spicy character to the wine and freshness. So it's very good. Yeah, Glenn's just said, value for money, which can be very hard to find in Pomerol. Yeah, I think also in Pomerol, because it's not classified, and there's quite a lot of change in ownership and change in how the properties are performing. It is unfortunately part of Bordeaux that I think you can get caught out. And yeah, you're right. Value for money can be very hard to find in Pomerol.
I guess the estates are just so small as well. They don't make much wine compared to the left bank, so there's not much to be found. And so the demand for it is very high, and that helps to push the prices up as well, unfortunately.
Right, shall we go across the river?
Right, left bank, and we're moving to the first wine that's actually Cabernet Sauvignon dominant, Chateau Ferrier, and we're now in the region of Margot, very, very famous region for its beautiful name. It's the only appellation in all of Bordeaux where you've got a chateau with the same name as the appellation itself. So that's, of course, is Chateau Margot, one of the 5 first growths, one of the greatest wines in all of Bordeaux, in fact, in the world. And along with Saint-Emilion, Margot is really one of the oldest regions cultivated under vine in all of Bordeaux. They think the Romans planted their grapes here somewhere over between 2000 and 2200 years ago. So the Roman poet Ausonius, he poetically called the region Marigella, and there's actually a chateau now called Chateau Marigella. That's where the name came from there. So it's the warmest of the major appellations on the left bank. So Margot is always the first to kind of harvest on this side here. And it's got the largest concentration of chateau that were classified in that 1855 classification. So there's 21 classified growths within the Margot appellation. So Chateau Ferrier is a 3rd growth, and it's a really, really interesting estate because in 1855, it was the smallest of all of the classified estates in the classification. It only had 8 hectares under vine at the time. I think now it's up to about 24, 25 hectares, so it's a lot bigger. But still, as far as left bank chateaus go and classified growth chateaus go, it's still one of the smallest. And it's not a wine that you actually find in many places. Another reason you've probably not heard of Ferrier, a lot of people haven't heard of Ferrier who drink Bordeaux, that not only do they not make very much because they were so small, but for about 40 years, certainly from the 1950s through to the 1990s, you could only drink this wine on board Air France in their first class. They made so little wine that was the only place you can get it. There was a little bit that went to French restaurants, and after kind of 1990 or so, a lot more of it started to go into the French restaurant scene, but it's not a wine that's traditionally been sold through the negotiates in Bordeaux. Liz might know the first year we started to bring it in, but it's not something that you find in many places. Liz, do you know the history of it with Glengarry?
Yeah, you're right. It's not something that we've imported for a long time. I think the first vintage, I'm thinking from memory, was probably around 05, and did very much, it ties in nicely with your story, found it in French restaurants. I tried it when I was there and went, we need to import this.
Yeah.
It has been quite hard to purchase, but its ownership relates to the Genesee family, who also a negotiant. So yeah, we do have good access to it now. So
now the estates in Margot are known for having some of the most elegant and refined wines, certainly in Bordeaux on the left bank. And Margot is particularly well known for its perfume. And you always get really lifted aromatics in a very good Margot, which is something you always find in Ferrier. I've always found it to be a really classic Margot, always of super high quality. Now, the estate itself was founded in the 18th century. It's founded by a guy called Gabriel Ferrier, funnily enough. He was a shipbroker at the time, and he was a king's officer, and he was in charge of hunting. And his cousin Jean was the mayor of Bordeaux in 1792. He kind of took over and expanded the estate at his time. As you've got those problems with those French inheritance laws, the property had to get sold off by the courts after he died, and his widow bought it, and then took over by her heirs after that. It kind of went down through a number of different heirs of the Ferrier family, and in 1952, some of the heirs of the family leased out the vineyard to a very famous wine broker and wine writer, I guess, by the name of Alexis Lichine, and he was the owner of Chateau Lucia at the time. And he ensured the maintenance and the operations, and also used the crop. And Alex Lichine, he also, of course, bought Chateau Prieur and renamed it Chateau Prieur Lichine. So you'll still see his name on that estate to this day, at this time. Now, it was bought by another family in 1988, I think was the last time that it was sold, and that family still owns it today. That was the Merlant family. And it wasn't until 1992 that tenancy agreement they had with Chateau Lucia finally came to an end, and his daughter could start making the wines herself from that point. Now, with those 21 different chateaux classified in Margot in 1855, it's obviously an area that has very, very high quality. Now, we're looking at completely different soil structure here in Margot to what we were looking at on the left bank. So now we're looking at deep gravels. So we're next to the Garonne River, and these are old river gravels. They're on a subsoil of limestone, but you've got gravels on top, and really deep gravel. We're talking about between 5 and 8 meters of just gravel going down. There's no soil at all. So most of the vineyards that Ferrier own are right in the center of the Margot appellation. And this is a kind of a 12 square kilometer plateau of these deep and white gravels at the time. So it's really poor soil. You couldn't grow anything on the soil at all except for vines. And it favors really deep roots to the vines. They go really deep down into the gravel, and they draw that water up from very, very deep down there. Now, the planting that they've got there, the planting within the vineyard is 64% Cabernet, 30% Merlot, 4% Petit Verdot, and 2% Cabernet Franc. And this is a vineyard that is now 100% biodynamic as well. And they've got some very, very old vines. 50% of their entire vineyard was planted in 1952. So they've got some super old vines here, and at a really high density, much higher than we see on the right bank. So we're looking at 10,000 vines per hectare, which is really, really close rows. Now, they were certified 100% organic, I think, from 2015. And then certified 100% biodynamic from 2018. So this is the first 100% biodynamic wine that we've ever seen from Ferrier, which is pretty cool. Now, if we look at the vintage itself, it's one that they found particularly difficult at the start there, but they thought it was incredible quality that came through at the end there, with remarkable character and a sweetness that wasn't often kind of seen in the wines of Ferrier. They compared it to 2009 for the richness of the wine and the generosity of that kind of solar sunny style, and then 2016 for its power and its smoothness of its tannic structure and that huge aging capacity that this wine is clearly going to have. So they thought a hypothetical blend of 2009 and 2016. So we can see in here 51% Cabernet, 41% Merlot, so a little bit less Cabernet than they've got planted in the vineyard. The average age of their vines across the whole vineyard is 45 years, so that's quite spectacular. Now this goes into oak barrels for 18 months, and it's 40% new oak in here. Now, the interesting thing about this is with their biodynamic move, they've also started to use some amphora as well. So 40% new oak, and also 20% of this wine has gone into the clay amphora. And I think, Liz, you might be able to tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, definitely. I think just to touch on, and in relation to amphora, just your comment on biodynamic. And, I think when we think about organics and biodynamics in New Zealand, we have a very high percentage of both practices here in New Zealand. And when you look at the Bordeaux region, they don't. And one of the reasons for that is that the weather conditions there, it's not going to be easy to farm biodynamically. And you just need to look at something like Chateau Margot, where they did all the work to get themselves certified organic. And then there was 1 year where it was all going so pear-shaped, they lost their nerve and they sprayed, and they lost their certification. And then they had to go through the entire process and get it again. And talking to them, they said it's such a battle. They know it makes better wines, but it's just such a battle with nature there, and a change in thinking in what is a very, very historic region. It's a historic region that would be horrified to know in the past what was put on that soil. So it is a change. M4 that Regan mentioned, we see a lot of those at Ponte Canet, and we're starting to see a lot of them in other places, and certainly there's quite a few there at Ferrier now. So an M4 is essentially comes from the name for a vessel used to hold wine, to store wine, and they're generally clay. The ones that are being used now, why they're being used is they're generally clay that's come from the vineyards, a concept of a complete approach to the winemaking, where you're using what's in the vineyard, what the grapes have grown, the soil that they've grown in, and what they've been used to being part of philosophically, then being used to create the vessel that they come and then do the next part of their journey inside. Scientifically, an M4, because they're round, as the wine ages, then everything in the wine stays in suspension. So you don't end up, in a tank, whether it's round and then with a flat bottom, you're going to have edges, and the suspension of the liquid becomes very different to when it's in an M4. Also with an M4, because they're clay, there's a porous nature to them, which the wine doesn't seep in through the clay, but the clay, when it's being produced, has compressed into it air bubbles that very, very slowly will be released into the wine when it's in an M4, creating a micro-oxygenation of the wine, which creates a different textural element to it. I can go on all day about M4, so I won't. Regan, did that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. I think 2016 was the first vintage they used them here at Ferrier.
Yeah, Ferrier is a property that, the move to biodynamic's been a challenging one for them, and there has been some vintages there where you could question whether they've made the right decision. But certainly I think this one is showing 100% that they have. And it's a property, like a lot of Bordeaux properties, they tend to go up and down over history. And this one is definitely on the up, and it's one to watch for sure.
Yeah, I've always loved it. It's a really classic style Margot at a good price. It's always high quality. There's very little made. Sells out quickly. It's always a nice bottle to bring out.
For sure. Right, so moving on from there, we're going to change tack a little, but still stay on the left bank, and we're actually moving back to Merlot. but not moving too far from where we were before, because we're moving to Pauillac. And Pauillac is Cabernet country, but what we're looking at is Le Terroir de Longueville, which is the historic second wine of Pichon Longueville Baron. So let's start just first of all with a little bit of history on Pichon itself, because if you're familiar with the area, you will know that there is Pichon Longueville Baron and Pichon Longueville Lalonde. So there is two, and they sit on opposite sides of the road. And in fact, they started their life together. So they were both classified in 1855 as second growths, but historically they were together. They acquired the name Pichon Baron through marriage. And what actually happened is Thérèse, who is the daughter of the founder, she received the estate as a dowry. And she then married Jacques Pichon Longueville, who was the first president of Bordeaux. Now, at that stage, it was changed to be known as Pichon Longueville Baron. He was 19 years old when he took over the estate, and he died in 1850, aged 90. And on the night of his death, he actually had the wisdom to divide the property up before he passed away, which was good. And he had 5 children. And what he did was he divided it into pieces so that they got land, the winery, the chateau. But essentially, what happened was his 2 sons then joined bits back together and have what is now known as Pichon Baron, and his 3 daughters put together what they had, which became Pichon Lalonde. So that's how originally it was together, and then it became 2 separate things. The modern era of Pichon Baron comes with AXA Insurance. So AXA own a number of top properties around the world, including in Bordeaux, Pichon Longueville Baron. They own Chateau Lucia as well, Puy too. They have Quinta do Novel in Portugal, and a number of other top properties. Under AXA's stewardship, Jean-Pierre Matagon has become the technical director. He's been there for a very, very long time. Very warm, generous man who is Pichon Baron through and through. I've been very fortunate through my study of wine that he offered to let me spend a couple of days with him at Pichon, one in the vineyard and one in the winery, to learn what they do there. And it's extraordinarily detailed, as you can imagine. Overseeing all that is Christian Seeley. Christian looks after all of the AXA properties, and some of you will have met when we had Christian do a Zoom tasting for us, and you'll know he appeared bright and early, French time, already dressed in his bow tie. So this one, Terroirs, is the second label of the Grand Vin, the top wine. But it is one of the 2 second wines. It's the historic second wine, but they do now have another second wine, and the other second wine is Griffon. Now, why would you have 2 second wines from an estate? It's a little bit confusing. One of the reasons for that is that Terroirs is the Merlot-driven second wine, and Griffon is the Cabernet-driven second wine. And this is because there's a part of the vineyard that sits behind the chateau that has quite a bit of clay in it. And that's very good for, it's very rare in that part of Bordeaux to have this much clay, but it is very well suited to Merlot. Since the 2000 vintage, they've dramatically reduced the amount of the top wine that they make. So they used to make 30,000 cases of their top wine. They now make 15,000. The benefactor of that has been this wine, which they're making more of, but the quality of this has never been as good. It is 66% Merlot, 20% Cabernet, 8% Cabernet Franc, and 6% Petit Verdot. And the Petit Verdot did very well in this vintage. It doesn't always. It's the portion that does vary a lot in this blend. But it really does give a lovely fragrance to it that you'll see. In terms of the winemaking, it has all the expertise and the technical know-how that the Grand Vin does. And it's made in exactly the same cellar by exactly the same people. 40% goes into new oak, 60% goes into 1-year-old oak, but this all goes into oak. So this is a very, very serious wine. It does go into oak for 18 months, and it was 30% of their total production this year. So 18 for Pichon, it is quite a small year. And that does mean there's less of this available. I had a quick smell of this before and thought, wow, that's just impressive on the nose before we go any further. You've obviously tasted it while I taste it, Regan. Have your thoughts?
I mean, this is just a great wine year in and year out. It's just so dependable. And I think for a high quality Pauillac, especially for those who like their Pauillacs a little bit softer, because of that higher percentage of Merlot, it's a really great wine for them. It's not a wine that requires decades of aging, even though the quality is really high, which I think has always been the great thing about this wine. Drink it up to about 10 or so years of age. I mean, you can push it further if you want, maybe 15, but it's a wine that you can drink a nice Pauillac from a good vintage, within a reasonable time frame, and it's always super high quality.
Yeah. I think we've had some good comments there, and I think, Stephen, you're spot on with the fact that it's not a blockbuster and that we've seen bigger wines from this property before. But it has, I think, if you think back to what I said at the beginning in terms of the characteristics that you find in some of the greatest wines from this year, is there's a purity and a seductive nature to them. And this has purity. It's there in abundance, and just so well balanced. And this shows the quality of this chateau and what they can do to create something from what nature gave them that is so different year in and year out. Beautiful wine. Just on Le Terroirs, I mentioned before the negotiant system and how you have an open market. So essentially that does mean that most wines in Bordeaux, any importer into New Zealand could buy. There are some exceptions to that, particularly with the second wines of the property, and some of those are sold exclusively. And Le Terroir de Longueville is a wine that is exclusively imported into New Zealand by Glengarry. Something you'll only find with us. And we're very proud of our association there and our partnership. I think we've got Regan speechless.
Yeah, I like that wine every year. Yeah, it's a winner.
Yeah, sure is. Ages very well too. And I think, Anne-Marie, you're mentioning the dinner that we did with this property, which was up at the French Cafe. And we were fortunate enough to try a number of back vintages, and this certainly does age very, very well. Right, should we move on, Regan?
Right, final wine. So again, we're in Pauillac, and I mean, it's fitting we finish in Pauillac because Pauillac probably makes some of the most classic textbook wines of all of Bordeaux. It actually doesn't have that many classified growth estates within Pauillac, but it does have 3 of the 5 first growth estates in all of Bordeaux. So you've got Chateau Lucia, Chateau Mouton Rothschild, and Chateau Lafite Rothschild, three of the greatest wines in the world here. And I mean, these are wines that can age, you know, for 50 years or more, especially due to the high percentage of Cabernet that we see in the top wines, which is what we're going to see in this particular wine here as well. So Pauyac's kind of the largest city in Medoc, and it's got easy access to the docks as well, which in the old days with horses and wagons was very, very good for the development of this appellation as well. Now, this is a huge appellation. We're looking at 1,200 hectares under vine here as well. And you've got 115 different growers in the region as well. There's 8 million bottles of wine coming just from Pauillac alone. And we're situated here well north of Margot. You've got St. Julian just to the south. There's like a small stream separating them. And then you've got Saint Estephe just to the north there as well. Now, the terroir that we look at here is a lot of really deep river gravels. You're right alongside the river here, especially somewhere like Chateau Lucia as well. And you've got elevations ranging from 0 kind of sea height up to about 29 meters of deep gravel coming through there as well. So it's kind of higher elevations in the north with that deep gravel. And then in the south, you've got these larger gravel rocks and stones with more kind of clay in the subsoil as well. But really great for drainage, no problems with wet vintages here, and really, really deep roots going down from these vines. You've got all of this ample water that can be dragged up when it's a dry year, because it's all set down there, and you've got the deep underground rivers as well that it can pull it up from. Your microclimates of your vineyards that are kind of slightly closer to the river are a little bit warmer than the ones that are a little bit further inland as well. Now, Auberge Liberal. I think it's one of the few estates in all of Bordeaux that's got like a 3-barreled name. It's pretty unusual. And where it comes from is the Liberal family, and they've run the estate since somewhere in the early 16th century. They've had it all the way through that time period as well. As wine brokers from kind of father to son, they would sell their crops through the Netherlands and Belgium. And the Barge part of the name comes from the sector that sits just between St. Julian and Pauillac proper, which is kind of a raised section which was known as the Barge, and that's where their vineyards are here. They border directly onto Chateau Latour in some places there. And half of the vineyard of this, I think, is directly next to Chateau Latour, and the other half is directly behind Pichon-Baron, which is in that kind of large plateau there. Now, it was purchased by the Cruz family, which is a very, very famous family in Bordeaux in around about 1960, and they owned Chateau Pontet-Canet at the time, which was also a 5th growth, the same as this. And they launched this vast program of replanting all of the vines across the estate. If you look at some photos of it, it's a beautiful estate, probably only about 500 meters from the river. And then sold again in 1982. And the Merlot family, they again, who own Chaspleen, they put some huge investment into it at that time there. Really started to spend some massive money in both the vineyards and on the property as well. So if we look at their soil structure there, they've got 2 different parts within the vineyard. They've got one part that's really deep gravel, and the other part that's kind of chalky clay and limestone, giving the power and the minerality. So the gravel soils are the ones closest to the Gironde estuary, and the other ones are a little bit more kind of inland. Now, if you look at the estate itself, it's about 30 hectares, and they've got 70% Cabernet Sauvignon planted and 30% Merlot. So that's what we see in the vineyard. And in fact, it's very, very close to what we see in this particular wine here. Now, there's a little bit of a difference between the information that I found about this wine originally and the information that they've got on their website. So on their website, they say that this is planted, 79% Cabernet Sauvignon, 21% Merlot. So there's a little bit more Cabernet in this than we would normally see. Really dense plantings, again, 10,000 plants per hectare here. 40% new oak in this wine, and for 16 months. So not as long perhaps as some of the other ones. And again, a little bit like we saw with Ferrier at Auberge, the same owners now own both estates, and they also think in Pauillac that this wine for the estate is a hypothetical mix of that 2009 for the richness and the roundness, and 2016 for the huge tannins and the power and the smoothness of those as well. So let's give this a try if you haven't already.
I think, Regan, just smelling it, you know, if you think of sort of Pauillac and the classic sort of markers of what Pauillac would be or should taste like, you know, you sort of think of that like pencil shaving,
Yes.
and, you know, that's there on the nose. And then structurally, they're always quite bold. They've got shoulders, you know, they're quite square, quite structured wines. And they're generally very classically Cabernet. And this is just all of that. Like, if you wanted something that is just textbook what Pauillac should be, that's it.
Yeah, I think so. They used to have a lot more, they used to have more, some certainly Petit Bordeaux that was planted in the vineyard, and those vines have all been pulled out, and the percentage of the Cabernet Sauvignon has been increased over the time. And certainly the best terroir in the vineyard is where the Cabernet is, and that's in that section that's right close to Chateau Lucia as well. So next to l'Enclos, which is the heart of Chateau Lucia. So I guess that's one of the problems that these guys have had over the years, is that their vines are in a myriad of different terroir within the appellation. So they've got some that are incredibly good, some that are a little bit further inland, and then in some vintages where the quality is just not so good overall, it makes it hard to make a harmonious wine, because you've got all these little plots in different places, and it's hard to bring those together. But in a vintage like 2018, that's not a problem at all. I think average age they're looking at is about 35 years of age here. It's been self-sustaining for a long time. They've recently gone through conversions. So they were certified organic in 2018 and biodynamic in 2019. So I think this is the first 100% organic wine that they've done, and the next vintage will be the first 100% biodynamic wine they've done. But you can see that's certainly a trend that is expanding in Bordeaux, and it was really started here in Pauillac, probably with Pontet Canet. I would say they were the first of the estates to really show how that could be done, and people saw that huge lift in quality that they had over the kind of the decade or so that they were working on it, and now everybody wants to do it because they can see that it just makes better wine.
Yeah, it certainly does. That's brilliant. I think Glenn, your comment there is spot on. You know, the quality to price ratio is excellent for this wine. And the Ferrier, and I think, you know, both of them, yes, under the radar, but also reminds us with Bordeaux that there's some properties, there's a collection of them there, sort of the blue chip properties that everyone goes hunting for. There's a lot more to Bordeaux than just the blue chip properties. No, nothing against them at all, and you know, certainly we sell them. But you know, there's a lot of quality and a lot of brilliant wines right across the region.
Yeah, I mean, the estate itself, in terms of aging, somebody was asking about aging in this, they expect this wine to kind of be ready to drink around the 25-year mark. That's when that, you know, you might like it a bit older, you might like it a bit younger, but for them, that's when they think it's going to be peaking. So, I mean, this has got a long life ahead of it.
Oh, very good. Thank you, Regan. What we'll do shortly, folks, is we'll just open up to a bit of a Q&A on the tasting and the wines and see how everyone's gone. Just wanted to share a couple of things with you, perhaps in conclusion, apart from the fact I don't think we need to go on about the quality anymore, because you can see it. It's in the glass and it's very clear. This is an excellent vintage. Just on the glasses and in terms of the samples today, we are preparing all of our samples for our Zoom tastings using argon, which replaces the air that's in the bottle and keeps the wines from being in contact with air. And these wines were actually prepared as samples a week ago now. And looking at them today, they're spot on. I see absolutely, well, in the sample set that I've got, there's no faults with them at all. And that's a whole week in small bottles. Delighted to see that, and delighted that that's the quality that we're putting out in our tastings. So great work by the team. I see we've got Kyle, who actually did them, just joined us, so congratulations, you've got them in perfect quality out to everyone. The other thing, just on a commercial side of it, is we have landed these wines recently. We did sell a large amount of them on Pomerol 2 years ago, and those who have purchased that way, you'll be receiving your orders soon. We are waiting until we move out of restrictions to courier. Not a good idea to put things on couriers right now, but if you're in Auckland, you're welcome to collect them from us. We do have some volume of some of the wines that we've tasted today, but did just want to share with you, particularly those who have bought sort of more broadly through this vintage already. We have sold out of a whole lot of things, to the point that I've gone back to try and buy some more. And these wines are already fetching a much higher price than what we paid for them 2 years ago already. That's coming from a number of things, from the quality of them, but also there's just an insatiable thirst at the moment for fine wine globally. I think it's come about from so many lockdowns in so many countries and people drinking through their cellars, that there just seems to not be enough of these wines to go around. So certainly, if you're interested in any of them, do touch base with us, and I suggest you don't sort of think about that for too long. Also wanted to share with you that we are doing some more of these tastings. We will go back to in-person tastings. We did do that at level 1 last time, although I think we will need to look at what the future looks like to work out when that happens. But in the meantime, through October, we have just released today a schedule of virtual tastings, so they're all up on our website. And the next one that Regan and I will be doing is fine wine tasting that we're going to present together, that's a little bit eclectic. To be honest, it's everything that's arrived in containers recently that Regan and I want to try. So it's from all over the world, and it's just an eclectic collection of fine wines, but we thought that'd be a bit of fun. So before we go to a Q&A, Regan, thank you for joining me to present those wines this afternoon, and thank you all for joining us for the tasting. Appreciate the support, and it's been great to have you all online. So thank you all very much. You can unmute yourself if you have any further questions to ask or any comments to add.
I've certainly been looking forward to trying these wines. I've written so much about the 2018s and haven't actually tasted any of them until tonight, so this was really fun.
Cool. I think I've got you so that you can unmute yourselves. I think so. Have I? Oh, yeah. What did you think, Stephen?
Yeah, and I thought fantastic. I mean, all quite different, but yeah, all showing really well. So it's just what kind of floats your boat. But yeah, across the board, really good quality. So thank you.
Oh, a pleasure. A pleasure. Very good. Chris, you happy with your purchases now that you've seen them?
Yep. No, it's all good. Happy about that. Good to taste them now too. So,
do you have a favourite wine out of that lineup, Chris?
I did. I think I like the Bougainville was a bit of a surprise. I didn't buy any of that, so I've asked you for some. So, but yeah, actually, I liked all of them really. They're all exceptional, really, for such a diverse sort of range of wines, and you know, probably the La Serre was probably one of my favourites.
Yeah, nice. I think the great thing about this vintage as well is it's the first in the trilogy, right? So 2018, 2019, and 2020 that we've only just sold on Pomerol. We're not going to see that for another 2 years, but it's the first time we've seen 3 great vintages in a row in Bordeaux ever. I think so. To try this first one here today really shows really interesting.
Cool.
Yeah, hello from Invercargill. There's 3 of us here at Jim Hannon's place in Invercargill. Myself and Jim and Stefan, who's a Frenchman, runs a wine shop in Invercargill. We enjoyed the wines tremendously, all of the wines. There were a couple of special ones that really stood out. And we were most impressed with the knowledge of both Liz and Regan. And it's fantastic to be able to enjoy this kind of tasting from Invercargill without having to come to Auckland. So thank you very much.
Excellent. It's great to see you online, Noel, and that I think is one advantage that we have seen with COVID is being able to do these virtual tastings and be able to see customers like yourself who have been buying from us for a very, very long time, and we've never actually seen it at a tasting. So it's been fun.
Yeah, I think, Noel, your support of us and on Pomerol over the years has not gone unnoticed. Very good. Have we got Glenn there?
Thank you.
Enjoyed? Oh, we might not have any sound. Very good. Cool. Well, thank you. Thank you all for your lovely comments there. And we'll see you at the next tasting.
Thanks, guys. Awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks so much.